Welcome. For today's social studies lesson, we're going to continue learning about Canada and learning about Oscar Peterson and his life in Montreal, Nova Scotia, in um, in Canada. So to begin with, we're just going to take a look at that neighborhood that Oscar Peterson lived in. So Oscar Peterson died on December 23rd in 2007, and though much of the neighborhood that he grew up in is gone, it was demolished by the construction of the Ville Marie Expressway in the 1970s. His legacy lives on in the students and jazz enthusiasts who are influenced by his music. Now, the neighborhood he grew up in was called Little Burgundy, and we read about that in the book we read last week. And it was home to many working class black families. There were many black owned businesses in the neighborhood, and in the 1970s, there were 3,000 homes and businesses that were torn down to build this interstate expressway or highway. In the 1970s, less expensive apartments were built in the corner of the neighborhood next to the expressway. And then in the 1980s, townhomes were built in the center of the neighborhood. And in the 1990s, very expensive condos, those are like very expensive apartments, were built next to that freeway. And that's what we see here now, are these expensive condos. So this, what was once a black working class neighborhood where many families lived, over time it was replaced by a freeway and then these very expensive apartments. So Little Burgundy was home to many working class black families, and after the homes were torn down, the expressway was built. The people who were living there had to find new homes. They were either forced out of the neighborhood because it was too expensive, or they were put into the less expensive apartments next to the interstate rather than the homes they had lived in before. And because they were near the expressway with many cars, the air was not as healthy to breathe. So up here, you see government workers taking a photo of a home that they're planning to tear down. And then above here, we see the new public housing buildings that the city built as less expensive housing to replace the homes they tore down. What do you notice about these pictures? What do you see in the pictures? Do they look familiar? Here in St. Paul, we have a very similar story. In the 1950s, engineers and city planners wanted to build a road from Minneapolis to St. Paul. Now, in order to do that, they were going to have to go through a city that was already constructed. This road was part of an interstate. So it's a very big freeway and highway called Interstate 94 that connects St. Paul and Minneapolis. And it also goes all the way from Montana through big cities to Michigan. It passes through Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, all these big cities on the way here. And in order to do that, it had to pass through these cities. So many cities had to decide what's the best way to get from one part of the city to another. You'll notice that if you look closely, there are parts of the city where lots of people live, and then parts of the city where there's more land and space. So they had to decide if they should go around the city or through the city. In St. Paul, that highway goes through the middle of the Rondo neighborhood. City leaders considered two plans for where they could build the interstate. One idea was next to the railroad tracks through no neighborhoods. That's this green line here. So it went next to the railroad tracks and passed through no neighborhoods. The other idea was to go through a black neighborhood in St. Paul called Rondo. That's this orange line here. And the Rondo neighborhood is this blue section of the city here where there is a neighborhood. J.J. Hill Montessori is right here, kind of right where this blue line is here. We are just on the edge of the Rondo neighborhood. Well, they decided to build it through Rondo without asking the residents of Rondo, only asking mostly white business owners along this route. Black residents were forced to sell their houses and leave their homes and businesses. They were only paid part of what their homes were worth, and those homes were torn down to build the freeway. How do you think people who lived in the little Burgundy felt when they were forced to move? How do you think the people who lived in the Rondo neighborhood felt when they were forced to move? Do you think it was fair? How could the city leaders have done things differently? How are Montreal and St. Paul similar? And how are Montreal and St. Paul different? Today, we're going to take a look at those questions. Your work today is to create a Venn diagram. We're going to compare and contrast Montreal and St. Paul. We're going to include what you learned about the interstate and expressways and what you learned about physical and human characteristics. You can use Google Maps. You can use Google Earth. Try to include at least 3 ideas in each section. So you're going to write about how is St. Paul different from Montreal, that goes in these outside areas, and how are they the same or similar? Those go on these inside, this inside area where they overlap. So you'll have a blank Venn diagram, or rather, you'll be using a Venn diagram. And actually, to get you started here, we're going to give a couple details. So some things you might look at are language in St. Paul and Montreal. How are they different? Obviously, what country they are in is different. And then some things that are similar might go in the middle. You might say they both have rivers. Can you name those rivers? You might say they both have interstates going through them. Can you name those interstates? You might say they have important historical black neighborhoods. Can you name those neighborhoods? Include at least a couple ideas in each section. So here again, just to get you started, we've got a couple ideas that can help you get this going and off the ground. If you have any questions, be sure to let us know. Have some fun with this work, and good luck.